Because this system, despite some really big challenges at times, has basically held, I think a lot of Americans think of constitutional crises and the breakdown of democracy as happening over there. That is, overseas in other countries. We are exceptional, after all, or at least we tell ourselves that. But I want to use this as a way to start my part of the talk, where I don't necessarily talk about constitutional crisis, but I think about how democratic breakdown has happened in other countries, where questions like, how have liberal democratic states governed by constitutional principles faded into something else? Can this help us to understand what's at stake in the United States today? And I want to start with a big, huge, glaring problem. Democracy in the world is down. It's declining. Any measure of democracy globally has showed this over the past couple of decades. There was, in fact, a new report put out today by Varieties of Democracy called VDEM that sadly shows for the first time in quite a long time there are more authoritarian states than liberal democratic states. That trend had been going the other direction for a long period of time. Political scientists have come to talk about these types of reductions in democracy as something called democratic backsliding. I should say this isn't really a new issue. Political scientists have been looking at democratization and processes of authoritarian governings emerging for a long period of time. But it's taken on a new urgency, this idea of democratic backsliding, because we've seen so much of it in places like Hungary, Turkey, Russia, and Poland, and many other states. So, what is democratic backsliding? What's it look like? Democratic backsliding today isn't about coups or dramatic seizures of power. That can still happen, but it's pretty rare, actually. What we see is democratic backsliding is generally the erosion of democratic institutions and norms over time, perpetrated by duly elected officials. That is, officials that came to power through democratic means. This usually takes place very incrementally, and sometimes it's almost imperceptible to people. Picking up on that last point about it being imperceptible, political scientists Steph Haggard and Robert Kaufman in a 2021 article looked at 16 different cases of democratic backsliding and note that the stealth nature of democratic regress is one of the key common features of democratic decline. They also point out that other causal factors tend to be high degrees of political polarization and weak legislatures related to, in terms of power relationships, to the executive. So in our case, Congress and President. But the actual process of democratic backsliding and how we get to that point can vary. There's large variation here. So we need to think about the mechanisms of democratic backsliding, or as Steve Levitsky and Dan Zablat put in a very influential 2018 book, how do democracies die? How do they stop being democratic? Levitsky and Zablat argue that wannabe authoritarian leaders are sort of the key starting point for this. That is, all democracies have people who would like to actually be dictators or authoritarians. And those wannabe authoritarians display some common characteristics. You have leaders that reject or have a very weak commitment to democratic rules of the game, including electoral outcomes. 2, they deny the legitimacy of their political opponents, saying that they don't have a right to actually govern. 3, they tolerate or encourage violence, political and otherwise. And 4, they're willing to curtail civil liberties of their opponents, including the media. These would-be authoritarians, if they gain victory in elections, might have these tendencies, but they're still stuck in an institutional setting where they're constrained in how they can exercise their power. Things like checks and balances on executive power, separation of power between branches of government, independent judicial review, all of the things that make liberal democracies are there to constrain these actors. So what we've seen in terms of the story of democratic backsliding around the world is that those wannabe dictators have to capture the institutions of government and reduce or eliminate the ability of any opposition to operate within the system. How do they do this? Well, Levitsky and Zablat tell us it's good to think about it as a soccer match. That is, Quote, to consolidate power, would-be authoritarians must capture the referees, sideline at least some of the other other side's players, and rewrite the rules of the game to lock in their advantage, in effect tilting the playing field against their opponents. So this is a story of these would-be authoritarians that don't hold democratic norms, trying to lock in advantages and ultimately. The way that they do this is first targeting the referees of the soccer match, or in a democratic context, what we're talking about are neutral actors that enforce the rule of law. Judicial and prosecutorial actors, like the Department of Justice, law enforcement agencies like the FBI, independent actors tasked with ensuring executive agencies are following the law, like all of the inspector generals that we have within our executive agencies. These are the types of targets that we would expect democratic backsliding, the first targets of democratic backsliding. There are tons of examples of this around the world. I'm going to stay outside of the US for a moment. Hungary is actually a really good example of this type of activity. Viktor Orban won an election, decidedly won an election, so came to power through democratic means, but then packed the Constitutional Court, the equivalent of our Supreme Court, and packed the state tax agency, the equivalent of our IRS, and Central Statistic Office, like our Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, and many other formerly neutral agencies with his partisan cronies willing to do his bidding. President Fujimori in Peru was able to use security forces to cower opposition forces into not opposing his activities by using what would be the equivalent of the FBI or CIA to get damaging information on opponents and then threatening to release it, blackmailing those actors in effect. What we saw in Poland was Law and Justice Party, for example, packing the Supreme Court to ensure that they would never lose a court case in anything that was brought against them. Hugo Chavez went a step further and simply eliminated the Constitutional Court as a check against his power as he slid further and further into authoritarianism. I could go on literally all day with these examples. I won't. The point here is that capturing these actors and institutions allows the would-be authoritarians to do two things. One, it actually maintains the outward appearance of democracy because the institutions are not destroyed, they are just captured. So the rules are still on the books, the laws are still in effect, but they're enforced in different ways. What this does is the second part is that capturing the institutions this way allows the executive to be unconstrained in how they wield power. And this is where, once you eliminate any checks on power or neutralize those checks, these wannabe dictators can then go directly after political opponents and other actors in society. So in modern democratic backsliding, I would say modern authoritarian regimes generally, opposition isn't eliminated categorically. Opposition is allowed to exist, but it's sidelined or hobbled in ways that make opposition very difficult. The easiest way to do this is to buy off the opposition. We see this over and over again. Go back to Fujimori in Peru. He simply bribed everybody he could possibly bribe to get them to go along. Other times, it's going back to capturing the referees that provides the critical mechanism that's so important. Putin in Russia is a master at this, using this tool. Putin has used tax authorities, again the equivalent of our IRS, to strip the wealth of business people that oppose the government, and has been able to use licensing agencies for media outlets to be able to get media to come into line with his view. Anytime a business actor or a media start to become a little bit too much of a problem for Putin, these threats emerge from these formerly neutral actors, these now partisan actors, to get them to come into line. What's important is that all of this appears to be legal. This is enforcement of the laws on the books. But it's clearly intended to punish actors or punish opposition figures. We can see this in civil society too, not just government or media or business actors. The Putin regime passed a law, presumably about foreign influence in the country, with the intent of shuttering non-governmental organizations working on things like democratization, transparency, rule of law, human rights, and other basically liberal ideals. This was couched in the term that this could be a national security concern, that these outside influences were influencing Russian policies, but the intent was clear to shut down that part of civil society. That could be a bulwark against the illiberalism within Russia. In Hungary, after packing the courts and installing loyalists in positions of power, Viktor Orban went after another critical element within society, universities. He essentially shut down and forced to move the Central European University by attacking it relentlessly with the powers that it had that were at his disposal as leader of this. We can go back to Russia to see how important cultural voices are silenced. The post-punk performance artist Pussy Riot was famously prosecuted for hooliganism, right, this vague term of hooliganism, because they dared challenge Putin's view of traditional culture. These actions don't have to be total, and they aren't usually total. They don't have to be against every possible point of opposition. What's important for these would-be authoritarians is that they make examples of key actors so that other actors fall into line. So, after this, what we see in terms of this process of democratic backsliding is would-be authoritarians have to permanently rig the game into their favor. Two quick examples of this. Putin, for example, changed the way regional governors were selected. They used to be elected in Russia, so there's a type of federalism, quasi-federalism within Russia. And he changed it such that he gets to pick who the regional governors are, making sure that all regions of Russia would come to heel within Moscow. Viktor Orban in Hungary was maybe even more masterful than this. After winning a very big election in 2010, he was able to use this mandate to alter the constitution and electoral laws such that it permanently advantaged his party. So much so that in 2014, when his party, the Fidesz party, won just 44% of the vote, it was still able to retain 2/3 of the seats in parliament. Tons of other examples I could go in, but what I want to get to here in my last couple minutes is this idea. Well, if you like liberal democracy, this all sounds really bad, of course. So what's the key thing to avoiding this type of democratic backsliding that's been documented over and over by people? And Zeblatt and Levitsky argue, and I would say that they're right, democratic norms and the actors abiding by those democratic norms are really critical to think about. This is because no democratic institution can ever perfectly thwart authoritarian efforts. There's no such thing as a perfectly crafted democratic body. What we need are institutions that are bolstered by people who believe in acting in ways, shared belief in acting in ways about what's right and wrong within a democratic context. A quick way maybe to think about that is to reverse what I talked about before with the authoritarian components, the authoritarian leaders that Zeblatt and Levitsky talk about. That if we have actually widespread acceptance of democratic rules of the game, including election outcomes, acceptance of legitimacy of political opponents, the condemnation of violence, and upholding civil liberties of opponents, including the media, then democracy is going to hold largely. If these things don't hold, no democratic institution is immune from democratic backsliding into authoritarianism. One quick note on where all of this goes, and I'm going to cut this a little bit short so that I leave plenty of time for my colleagues. Where democratic backsliding lands varies tremendously. There's lots of different terms that are out there that you maybe have heard. Illiberal democracy, semi-authoritarian regime, and all kinds of other things. I think one important term that actually captures a lot of where democratic backsliding has landed is actually competitive authoritarianism. This is a term that Steve Levitsky with another co-author, Lucian Way, in a separate paper describe as a system defined as that where the idea of formal democratic institutions are widely accepted as a principle by which the obtaining and exercising power is legitimate. But incumbents in those regimes don't act in accordance with democratic ideals and values. Putin's Russia is a very good example of this. Putin was, in fact, elected. He continues to be elected, but he doesn't act in a liberal way. The thing with competitive authoritarianism, and forgive me for skipping a few things here, but competitive authoritarianism is inherently unstable because it is relying upon some sort of democratic legitimation without actually applying democratic ideas. And what it opens up in a lot of ways is because it has this reliance on democratic legitimation, there are still areas of contestation available, including electoral contestation. Competitive authoritarian regimes can't just outright lie about elections. They have to have some meaning, and that means they can lose. They also can't fully get rid of legislatures, otherwise it's just a full-blown dictatorship. So there's an opportunity for opposition to emerge. Judiciary can't be fully in the pocket of those authoritarian leaders either. There's an opportunity for maverick judges to come up and cause problems for the regime. The media generally can't be fully controlled either because we're not talking about full-blown authoritarianism or totalitarianism. We're talking about states like Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and others that have these elements of competitive authoritarianism that actually there are cracks there. So I could talk more about that later, but let me sum up what I wanted to say here. I think this exploration and thinking about how democracies slide into authoritarianism tells us some really important things to think about regarding the question of whether the U.S. is in a constitutional crisis. One, and this is most relevant to us today, this is an incremental process of losing democracy. It doesn't happen overnight generally. It's not an overnight phenomenon. It might be really subtle and initially not detected by a lot of people. And in part, it's not going to be detected by people because it's often couched in language that is talking about making reforms to support democracy. Second, there are points at which the slide to authoritarianism can be stopped, but only if actors adhere to democratic norms. The institutions will not work to stop the slide to authoritarianism if people don't believe in democratic norms anymore. Three, because competitive authoritarian systems and similar types of non-democratic systems rely on democracy, they are inherently unstable and therefore democratic backsliding can be reversed. I'll leave you with a somewhat positive note. Poland, it suffered from democratic backsliding for a very long time. In 2023, the Law and Justice Party was defeated and is back on its path towards a more democratic, liberal democratic way. So, all right, with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Professor Green.
Thank you, Paul. I want to start by thanking my colleagues for inviting me to be on this panel. There's probably almost no place I'd least rather be than to be talking about constitutional crisis in America, but if I have to do it, I'm glad to do it with you guys, so thank you. And thank you guys as well. It's a great crowd, and I hope that means that people are noticing that things are off the tracks and they care, and that's why you're here. My focus today in my talk isn't so much on whether the U.S. is in a constitutional crisis or not. I certainly think it is. And in fact, I think it has been for some time, even before the advent of Trumpism. And I'll explain why I reached that conclusion later in my remarks. But what I want to focus more attention on is an explanation for why this is happening. And I want to put the question in a kind of historical and contextual perspective. To do that, I'm going to look through three apertures: a long-term perspective, a medium-term, and a near-term perspective. So let's go ahead and start with the long-term perspective, and by that I do mean fairly long. If you go back to the beginning of large-scale human civilization, say some 12,000 years ago, I think it would be a pretty fair generalization to say that the story of all of those cultures has been one of great concentrations of wealth and power. That is to say, a tiny sliver of people at the top of the pyramid had tremendous quantities of both of those things, and the great masses below them had next to nothing. Until that is the 20th century, when a remarkable change took place in developed countries. And I think from our perspective here, well beyond the beginning of the 20th century, it's hard for us to really appreciate how big a change this was. But policies in those countries began to develop, including items like progressive taxation, regulation of businesses, fairness in labor relations, a minimum wage, the provision of benefits to the people by the government, such as retirement pensions, health care, unemployment insurance, and so on. All of this collectively put together resulted in what economic historians refer to as the Great Compression, in which the wealth of those at the top diminished and the wealth of the great masses below increased, hence Great Compression. The effects of these changes included the creation of a huge middle class in many of these countries, or all of them, where none or hardly any had existed before. And billions of people over the last century and more have lived much longer lives, have lived with far less fear, and have enjoyed the benefits of prosperity. It also brought these societies a degree of social cohesion that had never existed before. But there was a certain segment of the population, especially in America, especially among the super rich and also amongst conservatives generally, who hated this development. And that brings us then to our medium-term perspective. The initial conservative reaction to these changes, so in America, of course, initially this would be the New Deal period of the 1930s. The initial conservative reaction to these changes in the political sphere was to broadly accept them while arguing that they should be trimmed a little bit here and there. And the reason for that position was because the changes that we're talking about were very popular, and to oppose them would have been political suicide. You may know the name Dwight Eisenhower. He was the president of the United States in the 1950s. He was the embodiment, I would say, of the old-style, moderately conservative, center-right Republican that was dominant in America before the likes of Reagan, Gingrich, Bush, and Trump. And Eisenhower once famously and presciently wrote a letter to his brother explaining that position on these policies that I was just describing. And I want to quote from this at a little bit of length, so indulge me if you will. This is what Eisenhower wrote privately to his brother. His brother was arguing, we have to reverse these New Deal policies. Eisenhower said, "The federal government cannot avoid or escape responsibilities which the mass of the people firmly believe should be undertaken by it. Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history." Now, there is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes that you can do these things. Among them are H.L. Hunt, a few other Texas oil millionaires, and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. End quote. But so that was the stance of conservatives initially in reaction and for decades following the New Deal. But they regrouped in the 1980s, and there began to be a shift in the center of gravity of the Republican Party, and that continues to this day, pushing the party further and further to the right. And this is where our two stories intersect. That is, this is where the question of economic relations that I've been describing and the constitutional crisis come together. Let me ask you a question. Suppose you were a political party whose real agenda was to take money from 99% of the country's population and hand it over to 0.1% at the top of the pyramid, the billionaire class. Suppose your party had to compete for votes in a democracy where everybody gets to vote. How could you possibly win elections in that scenario? Probably the only way you can do that is to fool voters. And this is something that I think political scientists often get wrong. We political scientists often tend to think of voters as rational actors who make choices based on the pursuit of their interests, and we tend to define interests in material terms. So we expect voters to vote their pocketbooks, and they very often do that. But it turns out that people also have psychological interests related to their social status. And they can sometimes be persuaded to vote on this basis rather than on their material interests. And in fact, they can sometimes even be persuaded to vote against their material interests on this basis. And so if you tell low information, working class white male voters, for example, that they are better than minorities and they are better than women and they are better than immigrants, you can often get them to vote for the party that will actually take money from them and give it to ultra-rich people. The quintessential example of this, in my mind, at least prior to Trump, was the election of 2004. In that election, George W. Bush ran for re-election largely on the basis of passing a constitutional amendment outlawing gay marriage. and thus appealing to the status anxiety concerns of many voters and giving them a sense of superiority over some outgroup, in this case, gay people. But then, the minute that Bush was inaugurated for his second term, he dropped all interest completely in that issue and focused instead entirely on privatizing Social Security, which is a polite way of saying selling it off to Wall Street. Now, no one, of course, gives us a better example of using bigotry to divert the attention of voters and win elections, only then to serve the interests of economic elites than Donald Trump. Donald Trump made his political bones by deploying bogus and deeply racist attacks against Barack Obama. He then turned on immigrants, he then turned on minorities, and of course, the latest is transgender folks. If you think that he really cares about these issues, I've got news for you. He and his elite supporters are laughing at you. And not only that, they're laughing at you at Mar-a-Lago, where the gardeners and the dishwashers are undocumented immigrants because they provide nice, cheap labor. What Trump really cares about is the same thing that Ronald Reagan cared about and the same thing that George W. Bush cared about, which is making massively rich people insanely rich instead, and doing so at your expense. And you do that through tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy. You do that through deregulation, which has the same effect. You do that through the privatization and destruction of beloved benefit programs like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, and you do that through union busting and other similar policies. Regrettably, this practice of deceit has been highly successful in the last half century, so much so that beginning in 1981 with the Reagan presidency, much of the gains from the Great Compression have been reversed, and we have been returned to the old distribution where the tiny sliver at the top has enormous wealth and the rest of us have been stuck in neutral or worse. Economic historians now refer to the Great Divergence, which between 1981 and the present, where deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, the offshoring of manufacturing, the weakening of unions, and so on, is estimated to have moved, listen to this, $50 trillion from the pockets of the bottom 90% of America to the pockets of the top 1%. And that brings us then to our near-term perspective and to the question you may have been asking yourself, which is, what does this economic history story have to do with constitutional crisis? And I think the answer to that question is that you can typically only fool people for a short time and then they turn on you. And when that happens, you either get crushed or you need to double down in the use of power. This, I think, is the story of election after election in developed countries over recent years. That is, an angry and desperate public has abandoned mainstream political parties and institutions in favor of fringe political grifters with the hope of gaining relief, only to find that they've been duped, and then they vote them out and look for some other alternative. An outstanding example of this is Brexit, in which Trump-like opportunists used nationalist rhetoric to sell a narrow majority of the British public on the idea of leaving the European Union. Now, a decade later, polls show that the British public regrets this foolish decision by a ratio of almost 2 to 1. We're seeing the use of this Trump-style fake populist politics in country after country, and over again, those governments fail to deliver the economic relief that people want. At that moment, the parties in power face a choice. They can either continue to play the game of democracy and get clobbered at the ballot box, and this is what we saw in Britain, for example, in last year's election, or they can dismantle the democratic system so that they never have to leave office. And this is what Professor Fritz was describing in the case of Hungary. And by the way, it should be noted that Hungary is the absolute model and ideal for American conservatives today. And thus you can see, I think, and I hope, how a constitutional crisis like the one we're experiencing right now might be born and what drives it. In America's case, this has actually been going on for a while, but has now accelerated dramatically. There are many historical developments over the last half century that we could point to, and in particular, if I had more time, I'd like to talk at length about one of these that I think is a really significant episode in our history that not many people pay attention to, but that I think was actually a devastating moment in the history of American democracy. And by that, I refer to the presidential election of 2000. But Leaving that one aside, there are all kinds of examples of this constitutional crisis slowly developing in recent decades. They include, for example, radical gerrymandering, and if we have more time, I'll give you some examples of that, numeric examples of what that entails. So radical gerrymandering, voter suppression by throwing likely Democratic Party voters off the rolls, voter intimidation, election denialism, judiciary packing and judicial policy making, a tsunami of money flooding our political system and buying elections and thus buying government policy, the encouragement of foreign enemies to subvert American elections, stripping powers away from the office of governor and other state positions when Democrats win those positions. Again, I can give you examples of that. And of course, there was the violent storming of the United States Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to overthrow the election results of 2020. Today, what we're seeing is the destruction of congressionally created and mandated agencies and departments within the government without congressional action or approval, which totally smashes what is one of the most important powers Congress has, the power of the purse. And we're seeing governance through executive orders rather than through winning legislative battles, which also completely sidelines Congress as an actor in a system of supposed separated powers and checks and balances. We're seeing the attempt to subvert independent actors within the executive branch, such as the Federal Reserve Bank and the inspectors general, who are watchdogs against corruption, or should I say were watchdogs against corruption until Donald Trump fired them all. We're seeing intimidation of the media, of opponents of Trumpism, of universities, and even of law firms that represent clients that Donald Trump doesn't like. And we're seeing Donald Trump talk about shattering yet another part of the Constitution by running for what would be a prohibited third term. Does this amount to a constitutional crisis? Answering that question, I think, requires us to think about the essence of the document. To my mind, the American Constitution entails two key concepts at its very core and woven throughout its specific provisions. The first is that the people will be self-governed. In other words, America is not to be a monarchy or a dictatorship, but a democracy. And second, that while there will be a government which is endowed with powers enabling it to be effective, it will be significantly limited in its powers, and the powers of the actors within it will also be limited. That means that the people have certain rights and powers, not the government, and thus you get the Bill of Rights and American civil liberties. That means that power will be divided and shared vertically, and thus you get American federalism, which reserves some powers to the states. And that means there will also be a horizontal distribution of power within the federal government in order to guard against autocracy, and thus you get separation of powers and checks and balances. All of these concepts are now under siege by the conservative movement and the Republican Party in today's America. They are under siege because the policies Republicans seek to implement are unpopular, and thus in a real democracy, the party would fail. People don't want oligarchy or rule of, by, and for the super rich. People don't want Social Security destroyed. They don't want Medicare or even Obamacare taken from them. They don't want the rich to pay less in taxes than they do. They don't want labor unions to be crushed. They don't want the regulations that keep their air and water clean to be shredded. They don't want the minimum wage to disappear. They don't want, and I'm not exaggerating here, this is happening, they don't want child labor laws to be erased so that children can work on assembly lines at low cost in order to enrich factory owners. They don't want these things, and in a true democracy, any party that stands for these policies essentially has four choices. It can change its policies to reflect the will of the public. It can stick to its principles and lose elections and give up power. It can lie about what it will do if it wins power, or it can destroy the democratic system of governance and ensure that the public's revulsion toward the party's program never matters. Conservatives and Republicans today will not change their policies because those policies are why they exist as a political movement, and they have no intention of giving up power. They have lied incessantly, but it doesn't seem to be working so well anymore, and we're only at the very beginning of the Trump presidency. And so they have been and are massively accelerating now. They're opting for the fourth choice, which is to dismantle the democratic system. And this is why we are in a constitutional crisis today. Today's conservative movement and Republican Party cannot compete on the merits in a fair election where they honestly present their policy ideas. And they cannot sustain public support when they win elections and then take actions contrary to what they campaigned on and contrary to their populist claims. And so they have been choosing to wreck the democratic system just as Viktor Orban did in Hungary. And I'm very sorry to say this to you, but I fully expect that this is going to get far worse going forward. Trump is already failing badly, and I say that even amongst those who largely share his mission and his ambitions, such as Wall Street investors and corporate CEOs. And he's only 6 or 7 weeks into his term. This, I think, is a highly dangerous moment because Trump and his party will grow increasingly desperate, and they will grow increasingly willing to take radical actions to divert attention and to hold power as he doubles and quadruples down on his failing and unpopular policies. I wish I could be more encouraging about this, but I think it is more likely than not that national disaster of some sort is in our future. My advice to you is to buckle your safety belts and to do whatever you can to speak the truth and resist the destruction of those precious inheritances which our generations have been entrusted with, such as democracy and civil liberties and human rights and a rules-based international order and health and prosperity and just plain human decency.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Constitution and the origins of some of the parts of the government. In 1987, 200 years after the signing of the Constitution, retired U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall reflected in a speech that the government the framers had devised was, quote, defective from the start, requiring several amendments, a civil war, and momentous social transformations to attain the system of constitutional government and its respect for individual freedoms and human rights that we hold as fundamental today, unquote. And yet this amended Constitution, together with the Federalist Papers that James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote in defense of it, are still the yardsticks we use to measure the appropriateness of government actions. The framers needed a government that would be powerful enough to provide order and help grow the national economy. What they didn't want was another king. So the original Constitution contained a series of institutional guardrails meant to keep the government from becoming too powerful. Of course, the first of these was separation of powers. Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution set up the legislative, executive, and judiciary, respectively. Each article confers powers to one branch. In Article 1, Congress is granted the power to lay and collect taxes in order to, quote, provide for the general welfare of the country. Congress has the exclusive power of the purse. In Article 2, the president, quote, must take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Interestingly, Article 2 is less than half the length of Article 1. The president was not expected by the framers to be the driving force of this government. Congress was the branch that the framers were fussing about the most in 1787, and it's clear that Madison saw Congress as the engine of the new government. Article 3, the shortest article, is devoted to the judiciary. In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton wrote, "The courts would have the power of judicial review." They could interpret the Constitution, the Constitution and review the acts of Congress and the executive. Hamilton described the judicial branch as the least dangerous. Indeed, the courts would lack the power to enforce laws or even their own decisions. The second guardrail, of course, would be the checks and balances, small overlaps of powers that each branch shares with the other. So the president has a little bit of legislative power in the veto. Presidents also have a little bit of judicial power. They can nominate federal judges. But Congress has many checks on the president. The Senate must confirm appointments of administrative officers. They can remove presidents by impeaching them, and so forth. Of course, the third major institutional guardrail is federalism, as Professor Green mentioned. the division of power between the national government and the states. The states would retain a certain degree of autonomy from the national government, retaining powers like taxing, building roads, and regulating traffic. There was little argument at the Constitutional Convention about whether the document could be amended, Article 5, and little question that a Bill of Rights would be added, including guarantees of free speech, free press, assembly. Later amendments outlawed slavery, gave people birthright citizenship, gave black men and later women the vote, forced the states to afford equal protection, and support the liberties mentioned in the Bill of Rights. All of these were limitations on the concentration of power. I want to talk now a little bit about the changes in relationships among the branches over time. In the Constitution, the framers did not specify who would do the day-to-day administration of the government. So over time, presidents created cabinet-level departments staffed with employees to do that. As you probably know, George Washington had a Department of State, a Department of War, and Treasury. He had an Attorney General, and he had a Postmaster, for instance. The size of what we now call the bureaucracy remained relatively limited until after the Civil War. But industrialization brought the need to regulate business and industry. And starting in the 1880s, Congress began an assortment of boards and independent commissions to regulate unbridled capitalism. Congress created, for instance, the FCC, the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 to regulate the railroads. It created the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 to control monopolies. At the same time, Congress moved to professionalize the federal workforce. With the Pendleton Act in 1883, Congress made a merit-based system headed by a Civil Service Commission. When Franklin Roosevelt assumed the presidency in 1932, Congress helped the president by creating hundreds of agencies to aid in reviving the economy. It created the Executive Office of the President, remember that, in 1939. The administrative state became the fourth branch of government, really. Importantly, most of these executive branch departments and agencies were created and funded by Congress, which was empowered to do that by the Constitution. Congress retained the power to exercise oversight to make sure each one was operating according to its legislative intent. Congress had its hands on the levers of the administrative state from the get-go. But the rise of the administrative state led to a second major trend, a dramatic increase in the power of the executive itself. Mostly this was because of crisis, the Great Depression, 2 world wars. These created problems that were simply too complex for 535 people to manage. In 1921, Congress delegated or gave away a bit of its power of the purse to the president. It made presidents responsible for drafting and proposing a budget. In 1934, Congress delegated its tariff-making powers to the president. And then in 1946, a Council of Economic Advisors was created along with the power to recommend to Congress ways to reach maximum employment. Congress delegated power to presidents and allowed presidents to expand their powers without check. The Korean War and the Vietnam Wars, as you know, for instance, were famously not declared by Congress, but initiated and sustained by presidents. Now I want to talk a little bit about a period during which there were attempts to curb presidential powers in this system. Congress soon came to regret its complicity in the aggrandizement of executive power. And in the 1970s, after sparring continually with then President Richard Nixon and nearly impeaching him, Congress attempted to wrest some of its power back. The Impoundment Control Act of 1974 was a law in which Congress barred presidents from impounding or unilaterally refusing to spend money. Congress tightened oversight over foreign and defense policy and intelligence gathering, and it cut off aid for presidential military initiatives throughout the world. There was a partisan cast to all of this. Prior to Nixon, Democrats were happy to expand the bureaucracy and the powers of the presidency. But after Nixon and into the Reagan administration, it was Republicans who sought to increase the power of the presidency. specifically to counter the oversight of Democratic Congresses and the autonomy of what they considered a left-leaning bureaucracy itself. Conservative Republicans were concerned about the growing power of unelected bureaucrats. During the 1980s, unitary executive theory began to animate officials in the Reagan administration, and here's a synopsis of the extreme version of this theory. According to the theory, because of the separation of powers that I talked about earlier, the president reigns supreme within the executive branch and has exclusive authority to control personnel, agencies, and programs. Congress has no right, according to this theory, which has been largely discredited, to interfere. Congress has no power to create independent agencies. Congress has no power to place policy discretion in anyone but the president. It may not restrict the president's removal power of officials. Congress has no power to impose qualifications for executives in the administrative state. It has no right to create a civil service system insulated from political control. It has no right to require documents or reports from executive officials. In addition, the courts, according to this theory, have no right to tell the president what is constitutional and what is not. Presidents can invalidate portions of congressional laws even as they're signing them, using so-called signing statements. Essentially, then, unitary executive theory sees presidents as solely in control of their own branch, the executive branch, the bureaucracy, and also insulated from both Congress and the judiciary in the scheme of constitutional institutions. Republican presidents George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush tended to support unitary executive theory. George W. Bush made frequent use of signing statements and defended the use of torture and citizen surveillance, despite laws barring these practices. Democratic presidents, too, engaged in some of these excesses of this theory, but never went as far as to deny the court's power to overturn their actions. This is where we find ourselves amid Donald Trump's victories in 2016 and 2024. In his first term, President Trump refused to provide documents to congressional committees or have executive branch officials testify against them. The president fired hundreds of State Department officials, rolled back the missions of the EPA and the Consumer Finance Protection Board. The president attempted to destroy the civil service system by making employees with policy roles subject to politically based dismissal or the creation of the so-called Schedule F. When the president returned this year, he appointed DOGE, a so-called department that Congress did not establish, led by unelected appointees who have not been confirmed by Congress. Its mandate now is to eliminate agencies, programs, and millions of employees without congressional authorization or public comment and access some of the federal government's most sensitive payment systems, much of it by AI, by the way. DOGE has begun to eliminate entire federal agencies established by Congress, primarily the U.S. Agency for International Development, which helps people in developing countries and in disaster-struck areas, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a government agency that protects consumers from unscrupulous financial companies. The Department of Education is now also on the chopping block, as you probably know. The administration froze federal grant money authorized and appropriated by Congress, a practice which we mentioned called impoundment, which is closely regulated by the 1974 Impoundment Control Act. The president promised a buyout for retiring federal employees without the consent of Congress, without assurances that the government will be funded to pay those employees. It fired employees who have civil service protections mandated by Congress. It's tried to end birthright citizenship guaranteed in the Constitution. Now, many of these actions have been challenged in court, and some of them have been stymied, at least temporarily. For instance, 14 states, along with employee unions and good government groups, have challenged the role and methods of DOGE, which is not formally a department, but a renamed body, the U.S. Digital Service, that is part of the Executive Office of the President. Some plaintiffs, in this case, argue that DOGE violates the Constitution's requirement that the Senate offer advice and consent for major appointments. Elon Musk was not only never confirmed, But the administration refuses to concede that he's actually the head of DOJ, because doing so would require confirmation. Other plaintiffs in this suit charge that DOJ illegally violates privacy, including the privacy of student aid applicants. A federal court judge has blocked much of Trump administration's plan for effectively shutting down USAID. A lawsuit has sought to block a separate freeze on foreign aid, and courts halted an order to slash overhead at research labs funded through the NIH. Federal courts have more broadly stalled the administration's attempt to freeze as much as $3 trillion in federal spending. Thousands of fired federal workers are joining in class action complaints to challenge the Trump administration's mass firings, and state and local jurisdictions are suing the administration to oppose federal funding cutoffs to sanctuary jurisdictions and recipients of federal social programs. One of the measures that the administration has suggested might be employed to prevent these kinds of judgments is to impeach federal judges, and there have been moves in Congress to do exactly that. It won't, of course, be the first time in history. So is this a constitutional crisis? In most legal scholars' view, and in the views of political scientists, the Trump administration has clearly overstepped into congressional powers. But the president and vice president, as well as academic advocates of unitary executive theory, have questioned the power of the judiciary to review, quote, legitimate executive actions. Those are the words of the vice president. None of the administration's actions has been challenged by the president's party in Congress. So how will we go forward? Well, I've heard this described as three separate categories of cases. First, those actions that are primarily interior to the executive branch. The president will be able to fire some agency head. He has been allowed by federal courts to fire some agency heads and inspectors general, according to statute and case law. And the courts could uphold his power to do so. Second, there are actions on which the Constitution has already recognized the right and the executive has interfered with it. The 14th Amendment's recognition of birthright citizenship is one of these. Even with a 6-member conservative majority, it's unlikely the Supreme Court will agree with Trump's interpretation of the 14th Amendment. But then there's the most contentious set of actions, those where Congress has made a specific grant of power to the president or instructed him to do something specific, and the president has refused to do it. These would include spending money, maintaining agencies such as USAID, the DOE, the Department of Education, Consumer Finance Protection Board. It's these powers which involve Congress exercising broad powers but delegating some narrower powers to the president. The Impoundment Control Act, for instance, the Supreme Court has never ruled on this act, and it probably will do so in the coming months or weeks. Or eliminating federal agencies. Depending on how the agency was set up, eliminating an agency can require an act of Congress or establish a special procedure whereby reductions in force are to be achieved or personnel reassigned to other agencies. These sorts of questions, which surround USAID and the Consumer Finance Protection Board, are currently moving through the federal courts. Or reclassifying civil servants as Schedule F to be assigned at will by the president, which is the subject of an executive order, or fired by the president. Because Congress established the civil service, Congress's intent will play into whether the president can make this change by executive order. We are still not sure whether that's true. The resolution of these conflicts could dramatically shift the equilibrium among the branches. The case over unfreezing federal funds will likely go to the Supreme Court, as I've said before, should the court find Congress's 1974 Impoundment Act unconstitutional, as the president thinks it should, allowing the president to refuse to spend money whenever he sees fit, the constitutional balance between the branches will be dramatically altered and historically altered. Should the courts broadly construe the Congress's power of the purse, the Trump administration could very well just ignore the court. And then there's a number of things we could talk about. There was a talk in the law school last week regarding what happens if the executive branch ignores the courts, which it has actually not done yet specifically. There's a whole chain of things that might happen. But I don't want to go further into it. I want to give you a chance to ask questions. I do, however, want to say one last thing. In answer to the question, what can you do? What can we do? There are actually things that you can do if you're looking at what's happening in the federal government and wondering what kind of action to take, if you have questions or if you would like to talk back. One thing to do is simply to stay informed, to stay abreast, in particular, of refereed forms of information. Move beyond social media, please, to forms of information that are fact-checked. And I have a handout with the help of some of the students from Hofstra Votes and from law school professors. I have a handout in the back that gives you a list of a few websites and things. So stay informed. You can contact your member of Congress, either by phone or by mail. Figure out something in particular that you particularly support that's going on in the federal government or that you oppose, and let your member of Congress know. They do respond to this stuff because nobody ever writes to them. Talk to one another. Help each other and others in your circle understand what's happening and how it is affecting you, and it is affecting us on Long Island. Talk to one another, share with your friends your legitimate, reliable sources of information. I would add just a couple of things borrowed from Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. Remember your professional ethics. We are all training you to move on to become lawyers or professors, or simply to become democratic citizens. All of those roles carry with them responsibilities. So don't forget that as citizens and as professionals, we have responsibilities. Above all, to the truth. So believe in and stand up for the truth, as Professor Snyder writes on tyranny. And finally, stand up for institutions such as news outlets, civil society groups, and universities that you either belong to or you think are really great and you would like to see preserved. And I'll end it there and leave time for questions.
Please come to the mic in the center here for questions, and students have preference first, so please jump up there.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to speak about this today. I have quite a lot of questions lined up for you, if that's okay. And I can repeat them if you don't remember them because they're also really wordy. My first one is, what is your opinion on Trump's hostage, and doesn't it seem like he's mimicking Russia's behavior in that sense?
We'll probably have to limit it to just a couple of questions because you have folks behind you, but then you can get behind them.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'll just do one at a time. Let's go with that one.
You wanna?
So could you clarify, you said Trump's...
Opinion on Trump's
Hostage. He is trying to deport somebody who is legally a United States citizen, and his wife is 8 months pregnant and also a citizen of the U.S., but he was born Palestinian, and he's trying to get him deported.
He's a permanent resident.
So, I mean, in the U.S. specifically, he's mimicking Putin in Russia. So, one, as a permanent resident, this grad student in Columbia is subject to the same laws that you and I are, and there has not been any warrants that we know of for his arrest and no accusations that he's violated laws. So it appears very much that he's being detained for his political speech, correct? That is exactly what Putin, Orban, and other autocratic leaders do. They will find a way. So, for example, pro-democratic, pro-human rights NGOs in Russia were legally barred from acting. Therefore, they had to shutter and go home. It's the same sort of thing. It's because they were presenting an alternative view to what the regime was willing to abide by.
Okay, thank you.
Please feel free to come back up with other questions later too.
Hi, thank you guys for each of your individual discussions. I had a question for Dr. Fritz about the competitive authoritarianism. Could you just give another example on it or kind of elaborate on it a little bit more?
Sure. So competitive authoritarianism, let me just be clear, sort of as political scientists, we like to create ideotypes to be able to describe different regimes. Right? So there's variations on it. But the basic idea behind this is that any regime, not any regime, that it describes a regime that is clearly not democratic in terms of holding to the values and ideals of democracy, but it's still beholden to basically the facade of democratic elections, right? That is, and, that actually goes along with longer trends in international politics. Since 1945, the creation of the United Nations, the liberal world order, democracy has been seen as really the only real legitimate way to govern globally. So clearly non-democratic regimes exist, but they still claim to be democratic. So this is sort of, competitive authoritarian regimes are kind of related to that, or they're tapping into that trend. So what you could say very clearly is there's huge variation, but let me give you another example. I guess Mexico in the 1990s under the PRI was effectively a competitive authoritarian regime in the sense that no other party could break through to win the election. The legal structures of Mexico were applied unequally towards different actors. Those who supported PRI got off of things, and those who did not did not. So there's this huge variation of potentially competitive authoritarian regimes. The way that we're using it here, the way that I'm using it here, is to think about sort of what is most likely to come out when democracy starts to break down. And the reason that I think it's most likely, and this actually goes to what Dr. Green was saying in some ways, a lot of those competitive authoritarian regimes are also what we call kleptocracies. That is, the leaders are able to use the resources and functions of the state to enrich themselves. Vladimir Putin, for example, is one of the richest men in the world. Not on paper. He still lives in a tiny little apartment in Moscow on paper. But he's probably worth $200 to $300 billion. Because what he's been able to do by using the power of the state, been able to essentially capture all kinds of rents from this. So does that get to what you're getting to?
Thank you.
Thanks, Phyllis.
Hi. Thank you for having a talk here. My question is directed towards Mr. Green. You had said that voters aren't rational, and you were making
not quite what I said, but go ahead.
you had said something to that effect. So, and also when you consider that Donald Trump did win the popular vote, is your assertion that we aren't a real democracy, or that democracy isn't the best way to govern? I was a little confused by what you had said.
I absolutely think democracy is the best way to govern. It's extremely problematic. I like Winston Churchill's remark to this effect, which is democracy is the absolute worst system of government on the planet, except for all the others. So I absolutely favor democracy. What I said about rationality is that political scientists have a particular view of rationality, which has to do with material interest. And we, I think, mistakenly tend to focus a lot on that. And there's good reason for that, because I think a lot of times voters and other actors who are behaving in a political sense follow that kind of rationality. But I was trying to suggest that there's another kind of motivation for voters, which has to do with status anxiety, and that canny and dishonest politicians can divide societies between in-groups and out-groups and play on people's status anxiety and motivate them to vote, not only in ways that don't serve their economic interests, their material interests, but in ways that actually can be quite contrary to their material interests. And I really think this is the game that the conservative movement / Republican Party has been playing for, I don't know, since the civil rights movement, at least.
Do you think that could be applied to the Democratic Party as well, since they've had questions about certain elections in the past?
I'm not sure what elections you're talking about.
The 2000 election with Al Gore.
So I'm not sure what you mean by that. I think that election was actually stolen from the Democrats. And as I said, I think that was a pretty tragic moment in the history of American democracy that not too many of us notice or talk about. Democrats have stolen elections before, if that's what we're talking about, I'm not sure, but in 1960, it's pretty clear that JFK stole that election, right? He got the electoral votes from Illinois and also from Texas, and I think in both cases those were stolen, and it was a very narrow election, and so Nixon probably almost undoubtedly won that election. So I'm not sure what you mean by Democrats I don't think Democrats play from that same playbook that I was describing before, where you mobilize hatreds amongst voters in order to gain their votes and then fleece them. I haven't seen Democrats do that. I think Democrats have been somewhat complicit in that, but I don't think they do that in the same way that I've seen Republicans do for, like I said, 75 years or something now.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Hi, it's me again. Okay. So, ooh, that's not cool. I'm just gonna hold this. It was falling down. How is Trump allowed to defund and virtually undo almost everything that was placed to protect American citizens, considering that things have happened like this in the past? I think that the government would have tried to do something to put more laws in place to prevent this from happening again. And one more question. Is it possible for us to move forward with Al Green's proposal to get Trump impeached? And if so, can we do it?
Let me maybe even talk to both of them. With respect to defunding, we are a nation of laws, and the funding for government programs is created by Congress in specific laws, so that I mean, in general, the issue of funding, as I mentioned, and the president's refusal to spend is called impoundment, and there is a law that allows impoundment under very narrow circumstances for a short period of time. And if presidents want to do it permanently, they have to actually go back to Congress, and Congress has to have its final say-so. So there's a procedure, but the courts have to make a decision about whether or not what that procedure is going to look like. And in a broad sense, we're really not sure what's going to happen with impoundment. But I should mention, too, that each of these departments is created by different laws, and each of the destruction or the dismantling of each of them is going to be addressed in a separate lawsuit. So all of this is going to take a lot more time than it took to issue the executive order saying, the administration's not spending any money on this agency anymore. With respect to impeachment, that has been done twice. The president's been impeached twice, and he was not removed by the Senate. So there's a risk that might happen again, and I think the risk of that happening is pretty dangerous, to have impeachment simply used as a partisan tool.
Can I add something to that? Because it gets a little bit to what I was talking about with norms, I think, too. So Dr. Perotti is, of course, right about what's on the books and the laws that are there. But what I would say is that, with the laws on the books, there was never... There was never nobody imagined someone like Trump would come along and shatter all democratic norms. So the laws are not written in such a way as to protect against every eventuality, to ensure that a president couldn't come along who's not committed to committed to the same processes every other president was, even, I will say, dare say, Nixon. And therefore, laws aren't enough to do this. It gets back to the shattering of democratic norms that has been the hallmark of the Trump administration. And that's why he's been able to get away with it in that sense, is that we've always expected every president would just do the right thing in that office. And he showed that he is willing to do something else.
So do you think if his presidency were to ever end, since he is talking about a third term, and again, sorry. Okay. All right. So I lost my train of thought. Never mind.
Okay.
Here you go.
Thank you. So with regards to the Colombian graduate student who was detained by ICE or Homeland Security, whatever, you mentioned that he has the same rights as an American citizen, which he has some, but I know there are some differences, such as voting in federal elections. So he is a permanent resident, he's a holder of a green card, and I read that they already scheduled a hearing for him to determine whether it's legal for them to revoke his green card status. So my question is pretty much like, referring to him as a hostage, I don't think that's correct, as he's being shown due process with a scheduled court date and all.
We're going to, thank you. I think so that we can get through the questions, we're going to take a bunch of questions and then address them and as they've come. So thank you very much. We'll come back.
But yeah, go ahead, come on up.
My question is, do you think that we're headed towards another landmark Supreme Court decision like the historical one in Marbury versus Madison? And with the conservative majority right now, and especially 1/3 being appointed by Trump, do you think that the Supreme Court will be complacent to him in order to avoid looking powerless?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry. My question regards how Trump's attempts to annex Canada as the 51st state. I know it sounds silly, but as we see that this is becoming a more serious issue, how does that fit into the overall conversation of authoritarianism? And furthermore, how does the constant stream of lies and misleading statements from the Trump administration fit into the conversation of authoritarianism?
I never asked a short question before. So I would recommend that you answer the ones that just have been done. And I have a quick question later. I was deferring so you would answer the other people.
Okay. I don't know. As far as the court, I think probably, will the court surprise the president or surprise those who see the 6-3 court and rule against the president? I think the questioner was right. The court has to think about its own independence, and I think it's probably likely to be kind of a mixed bag, what's going to come out of the court. With respect to annexing Canada, I actually don't think that is serious on the part of the president, but rather a distraction, like many of the other things that he said, but my colleagues might say other things.
Did you want to jump in?
With respect to the question of lies and authoritarianism, I think that's right out of the bag of tricks that authoritarians use. I think you have to lie because people would be upset if you told them the truth. On Canada, I guess I would agree that at this moment it doesn't seem quite serious. Panama may be a lot more serious, just in terms of what public opinion would accept. But this is why I said at the end of my talk that this is a really dangerous moment, because I think a lot of times you have authoritarians and would-be authoritarians, when they get in trouble, They like to do something to divert attention and to create a rally around the flag kind of sentiment in the public, and that's exactly the moment where you would go out and attack some other actor in the international sphere. In terms of landmark court decisions, I would expect we're going to see a lot of them, just as we have been in recent years. There's so many questions that were settled that are now becoming unsettled, and so I think these are going to be decided by the court.
So I wanted to jump in real quick because we didn't answer one question about the Columbia grad student, and then I got something to say about Canada too, because it's a great question. The term hostage was used by the questioner and not by any of us. He hasn't been charged with any crime, right? That's the issue. There's been no warrant for his arrest. There's been no allegation of any illegality, any illegal act taken by this student. He seems to have been detained simply for his political positions. There is due process being played out now,